on the learned panelists, I'm just going to come on to actual numbers like a good banker. What is actually happening on South-South as regards trade and investment? If you see the numbers, they are highly encouraging. Developing countries have been consolidating. Their share in global trade, which was about 32% in the year 2000, just at the turn of the millennium, is 44% today, a significant jump up. And if you look at global FDI inflows over the same period, it shot up from 17% to 47% as far as the developing world is concerned. So clearly, the numbers are encouraging as far as the South is concerned. What about the South-South angle in terms of developing countries providing cooperation? This was 66% in 2015, significantly up, and moved further up to 74% in 2017. South-South exports, if we look at that particular category, also shot up almost sixfold, from 644 billion in 1996, about 20 years ago, to over $4 trillion in 2016. So the share also has been increasing from about 12% in 1996 to 24.9% in 2016. The significance of trade has been particularly more because the intra-regional exports of the developing countries have increased from about 42% in 1996 to a robust 57% in 2016. The highest share of intra-regional, of course, was in developing Asia at about 53%, followed by developing Africa, significantly behind at 18%, developing America at 16.5%, and Oceania bringing up the rear. So the numbers are looking good, but I'd like to come more to a paradox which was roughly referred in passing by Dr. Mohanty and also by Dr. Anthea, in terms of capital both as a constraint and as a problem. Typically, one sees developing countries as facing a capital constraint, and yes, in terms of internally generated savings, that is still a constraint. However, capital is available exogenously from outside the system. So what we are facing today is a unique paradox where capital is scarce domestically, it is available amply from outside. How does one bridge this? And here there are some interesting challenges which, in our own experience as being the instrument of the Government of India in its lines of credit, we have come across dramatically. How does one translate this availability of capital into the absorption capability of the countries where this capital is directed at? Typically, when a development project is sought to be set up, there is a local contribution in terms of local funding, land, right-of-way, labor, connections of power, and so on. This often becomes a very significant constraint in a number of countries. And the challenge of dealing with this is, in one way, one goes bull-headed ahead, completes the project from the outside point of view, and then you find a stranded asset because you don't have the domestic connectivity. The other way is to fund the entire thing oneself, including the local component, which has its own challenges because then the local commitment, or let's say the skin in the game, is significantly reduced. What worries us in this particular case is that you then have a project, in sometimes a sophisticated project, and like any industrial or a power plant, which can have significant safety consequences if it is not properly maintained or properly taken care of. Purchase of spares, maintenance of that project, operation and maintenance contracts are very, very significant, and we do live in some fear in some particular cases where cutting corners in order to save time. Like all developing countries, and I include India, my own country among that, we are big on capex, we are not so big on opex. We tend to stint on maintenance, and this becomes a big worry going forward. Secondly, and this is something which Anthea mentioned, the financial ecosystem. It is not enough to rely on capital from outside. One needs to have internal generation of capital. If one looks at the majority of the countries of the South, the financial ecosystem is either missing or not there significantly. Leave aside the development institutions, where are the banks to mobilize savings in many of these countries? Typically, savings are physical in many countries or cash under a pillow, which has its own attendant consequences of safety. But the intermediation of a bank is not there. Worse, the intermediation of a development financial institution is almost always missing. If I take the development experience of India itself, it was the development financial institutions from the 1960s which really built up the industrial ecosystem in India. A year which I would say always makes me sad is 1994. 1994 was the year when in India we transformed the DFIs into commercial banks. We've seen the result in India. I don't need to go further. Very interestingly, 1994 was also the year in which China set up the China Exim Bank and the China Development Bank. The divergence since that date, I think I probably don't need to spend more time on. The last point that I'd like to talk about is debt sustainability. We have been looking at development projects and building up, but we do need to focus on debt sustainability. There are several countries which have miscalculated and are now in severe trouble. So we cannot look at the issue of South-South cooperation or development cooperation without looking at debt sustainability. We learned a hard lesson from the HIPC crisis. There are warning signs flashing yellow right now, and we need to take cognizance of that. With that, I think I've used up my 5 minutes, so I'll hold back the rest of my talk for questions. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Mr. Raskunha. I think your point about developing local capacities is very important, but I think one of the 5 principles that was mentioned in the concept paper is that along with the support, this capacity building support is also very important part of South-South cooperation, and perhaps also one of the distinctive features of the South-South cooperation as distinct from North-South. So I think that is very important, and your point about domestic resource mobilization and financial ecosystem, that is also something that we have to do within our own countries so that we can take best advantage of South-South cooperation. Thank you so much. Professor Aristides Sitas, University of Cape Town, South Africa. Your turn, please. Yeah, 5 minutes.
Thank you. I would like to start with a qualification quickly, and thank you, Professor Chaturvedi, for liberating me from my role in terms of these debates and asking me to be here as a thinker. But unfortunately, as the conversation has started, I have to also wear my other hat as the chair of the South African BRICS think tank and also steering the think tanks this year, given the South Africa's presidency, because academy is always 5 years behind the reality as it unfolds at the moment. Now, and I also find myself linking what is going on here with the first session, because the links are more than obvious. So I think let me throw a few challenges, because I will have an opportunity tomorrow to speak properly for 10 minutes. Firstly, we are still prisoners of our national boundaries in terms of any measurement. It's our units of analysis is across our countries all the time, and yet we are pretending to be measuring something bigger than that. I think both models, both the structuralist model and the other model, are trapped within that paradigm, and they need to move not towards a unity or a synthesis, but to something new altogether in terms of measurements. We found that out as we were working in 2005 to 2008 for Africa's industrialization plan at the AU. And it didn't make sense why Ethiopia was growing at 12% an annum when it didn't have the raw materials the other countries had. And unless you understood bigger units and bigger flows, you wouldn't understand the dynamism even of growth. At a time when China itself is saying the old paradigm of growth has to go out of the window, and we need a new concept of growth. The new normal demands of that in their language. And yes, new geographies were mentioned, and new interconnections. And of course, the European Union has to be part of the story, but also part of the lesson. At the same time as the idea of conditionalities is disappearing, other conditionalities are coming in terms of the European Union's relationship to Africa, which is, unless you keep your people in your borders, you don't get aid. Finished, to put it crudely. Or unless you have some military arrangements that benefit X, Y, and Z country, there is no aid. So there are other new forms of conditionalities that are beginning to appear. And in Europe itself, as the concept is dying out in terms of conditionalities globally, the development debates, what else has happened to the pigs in Europe? But precisely the structural adjustment process after the crisis that was the issue for Africa or Latin America or the developing world. So we have to be attentive to these double standards in rhetoric, in what is going on. And yes, the BRICS effect has been profound. I'll come to it in a minute. And because everything that is done in and through BRICS creates new risks, and it is taking risks. And if we approached it through the old models of development and the old economic models of fiscal discipline, none of these ideas would have been aired or implemented at all, because they're too risky in terms of fiscal discipline. Now, multilateralism was mentioned. Yes, beyond aid, absolutely. But the concept of multilateralism on the African continent is to take us away of the Berlin Conference idea that Africa is divided in a certain way, and that everything is about the mine or the plantation and the harbor, and development means growth in those areas, as opposed to a rearticulation of the continent and development of new forms of infrastructure that for the first time connects the continent within itself properly. And that is why both the corridors idea that India is proposing and the Belt and Roads Initiative have got a very strong hearing on the African continent at the moment, because they're moving us beyond the existing models of development. And yes, indeed, all that's been talked about now is about discovering a new architecture of some kind in the world system. And yes, the empirical reality is changing at a great pace. There is the New Development Bank. There are major interventions coming up in terms of health. You were there, Professor Chaturvedi, when the idea of the vaccine-centered implementation, vaccine policy, and creating a new health dispensation has been approved, both by the think tanks and by our countries. So watch out. The things that deemed to be unprofitable in economic sense, that could deal with Zika, Ebola, malaria, dengue, and so on, are on the agenda. And it's a risk, but it's going to be a major expenditure coming that way. And artificial intelligence, yes, but for public benefit. Why not for public benefit? Those debates are there. And inclusion, and the fact that on the African continent now, there's an agreement for a free trade area signed by 44 countries. Now that's a major risk and a major new development. I'm coming to an end. And therefore, finally, theorizing about these things is very important. And I don't know whether multiplex is the correct idea, though. In terms of a metaphor, the intention is absolutely perfect. But we don't want to watch movies. We want to make them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Sitas. I wish I could give you more time. Very interesting. I think the need for re-articulation and reimagination, I think, is very important. And you have also mentioned about some of the emerging risks which we will have to take into account. Thank you so much. I would now like to give our third special commentator, Professor Sriram Chaulia, OP of OP Jindal Global University, New Delhi.
Thank you, Professor. I just want to highlight what I think are challenges in theorizing the new South-South relations of today. Professor Maudsley was mentioning Raoul Prebisch and all the dependency theory and the history of this academic discourse. But I think we need to rethink, because obviously the social structures as well as the relational structures within developing countries and between developing countries have changed a lot. So we used to be primarily driven by a kind of a neo-Marxist understanding of South-South cooperation as somehow distinct from what were seen as hegemonic theories like realism or liberalism in the international relations discourse. But I think neo-Marxism is also inadequate in today's time to be able to frame the kind of South-South cooperation that is emerging. So why is it inadequate? First of all, I think there is a role for national capitalists and national capital in the figures that are being thrown around. Professor Acharya's keynote today was talking about the volumes and how they are, skyrocketing in trade and investment and all these things. And much of it is driven by large companies, conglomerates within dominant developing countries. Now you look at the Fortune 500, look at the top 10, you will have at least 5 Chinese companies in it, right? So the neo-Marxist paradigm is insufficient to explain these things, because the assumption used to be that we cannot industrialize and we cannot scale up and we cannot go and capture world markets. But now we are in many sectors. So as opposed to transnational capital, which is somehow unmoored from governmental or social control. Wall Street, I don't think really serves American interests. We saw that in 2008. National capital, I think, has to be brought in along with social forces. And of course, the factor we have always mentioned is there must be a legitimate role for the state still in driving South-South relations. So I co-authored a journal article with Horace Campbell in 2009, World Affairs, about China's role in Southern Africa. It was called Unequal Equals. And as you know, there's been tremendous interest and outpouring of scholarship on what China is doing in Africa. And there are so many different perspectives. But this is significant, because this is where we need to look at the empirical cases and come up with new theories. I don't think either realism, Marxism, or liberalism really captures what is going on today. And that was our point in that original journal article as well, that South-South must stand on fresh legs, which is devoid, which will obviously borrow some components from the existing theoretical principles, but will transcend them as well. My second point is about narrow nationalistic, territorial, and geopolitical rivalries. There are about 70 active wars, internal mainly, across the world today. As you know, we have a massive forced displacement problem with over nearly 70 million people either refugees or internally displaced. And a lot of these wars, almost all of these wars, are happening in the global south. And when we talk about development cooperation and trade and finance, we often underestimate the obstacles that these armed conflicts place to South-South cooperation. And the real question is, how do we theorize the concept of the greater common good, which has underpinned South-South cooperation forever, right? Most of us are well aware of the notion of national interest, and I think Professor Maudsley was mentioning this concept of the national interest. But in what way is this national interest being molded to meet our notion of the greater common good? In other words, to put it crudely, in what ways are we keeping aside our deadly disagreements, especially within our respective regions? And in what way are we able to still promote this greater common good? Often we are told that BRICS, for example, is a failure according to the Western narrative because India and China cannot get along and they are rivals for supremacy. Likewise, you have many ongoing geopolitical rivalries and conflicts that we have not yet found a means to subsume them within the notion of the greater common good. And I think the dialectic I don't agree with the Marxist framework, but the dialectic is an interesting notion here, because still national interest versus greater common good, what are the new theoretical lenses we can focus on? I think that is something is important. We need cooperative champions within the global south, states as well as social forces that go beyond it. Let me just conclude by talking about the new institutions. We are all very proud of the new institutions that have come up at the level of South-South, and we know that they are distinct and unique and different. Dr. Sat Chaturvedi and I have been talking on TV a lot about how they are different from the post-Cold War and post-World War II institutions. But we have not yet developed abstract notions of the uniqueness of these new institutions. There's a lot of empirical content out there. I think the challenge for us as, in theory is to come back to say, in what ways are we still talking about them being non-imperialistic, equitable, green? Question mark. Are we green? Are these new institutions green? Are we based on Ubuntu and Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam? And what else? What is the role of accountable governance, internal accountable governance without quote unquote interference from outside. Because again, if we have to problematize South-South, the weak link remains a lot of highly unaccountable and corrupt governments, ethnically divided societies, and we cannot deny those realities. I mean, we bristle at them when the global north points them out, but these are factors. And sometimes these are driven purely by domestic. I mean, look at the war in South Sudan. It's been such a disaster for the last 4 years. And it's been such a disappointment for those of us who welcomed this new member into the Committee of Nations. And yet, we have not been able to really theorize how the new institutions can support peace building and conflict resolution processes. So my humble request is, while we are focused on development and poverty alleviation and rising from lower to middle income, all these are laudable goals, but the biggest obstacle we must think about is political. And a lot of the national elites of developing countries have been actually working to divide our peoples. And that is the fundamental reality which has not changed the last 40, 45 years. So where do we bring back this greater common good which will really bring the unity of the peoples of the global south? And how do the role of people and social forces come into our theorization, which is still state-centric or maybe at most corporate and multinational-centric? These are the big theoretical challenges. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Chaulia. I think your insights with regard to the theoretical construct as regards South-South cooperation, and you have also brought into our focus the heterogeneity within the South also, and also what are the distinctive features of the Southern institutions that we are talking about. I think very important contribution. Now we have open floor, Sachin. So we can eat into the lunchtime. 10 minutes. Okay. Please introduce yourself, and if you have a question to the panel in general or particular one of our panelists, please mention. Thank you. Yes, please. Yeah.
Thank you, Chair. I'm Andre de Melo e Souza from the Institute for Applied Economic Research in Brazil. I have 2 points, and I'll try to be brief. There seems to be a consensus in the panel that conditionality is no longer being applied in international development cooperation. This point was made by Anthea, it was made by Emma, and also by Paulo, if I'm not mistaken. I don't think that is wrong, but I think the statement perhaps needs to be qualified. What kind of conditionality we're talking about here? And this also has to do with the points that were made by Aristides. I mean, surely conditionality in what concerns human rights, models of good governance, or democracy, that is pretty much gone, I would agree. But there still are important economic conditionalities that have always been there, including in South-South cooperation, and political ones. If we look at the so-called recipients or partners, if you will, of China's international development cooperation and their voting patterns in the UN, we see that there is a significant correlation there. And that's not a coincidence, I don't think. It would be naive to suppose so. So that's my first point. The second one has to do with global governance. And the panelists, as well as Professor Acharya earlier this morning, seem to have an optimistic view of this governance, in as much as now we have new institutions, right? We have the NDB, we have the AIIB, and if there's a mismatch in terms of the distribution of power and the prevailing institutions from the post-World War order, now we have new institutions emerging that somehow seem to correct that. My question would be, what are the effects of that in terms of efficiency globally? I mean, that in itself might be a positive outcome, but it leads also to greater fragmentation. So again, what is the impact of that for the efficiency in the provision of global public goods? Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you for the 2 questions. Yes, sir, please. Is there someone on the behind? Okay.
Very briefly, Chair, thank you very much. Rajiv Bhatia, former High Commissioner to South Africa. I have questions to, just one question actually to both Mr. Steves and Mr. Sitas. We are all supporters of IPSA and BRICS, but I think somebody has to point out that the emperor doesn't have clothes. IPSA program is very tiny, and it has been like this for a long time. So we can certainly sing its paeans, but we must remember that the scale is very small. And BRICS, every year it is holding summits in various neighborhoods. It meets the leaders, but is still yet to start financing development projects outside BRICS membership. And this is creating its own sense of frustration all around the world. How do you feel we can fix this in terms of facing the challenges of new development cooperation paradigm? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ambassador Bhatia. At the back, yes, at the back, and then yourself, and then we will close. Yeah. Oh, you have a question? Okay. Please, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, colleagues. I think what I found, Philani Mthembu from the Institute for Global Dialogue in South Africa. Found it interesting, Paulo, the mention that Buenos Aires, at least 40 years ago, could be seen as a victory in essence for ODA. And that we then went through kind of like a 20-year period where South-South cooperation was basically forgotten. Now, as we go to 40 years after, whose victory will it be? Will it be a victory again for ODA in adjusting to South-South cooperation? Will it be a victory for South-South cooperation in shaping North-South cooperation? So whose victory are we moving towards?
Thank you. Yes, over there. Yes. Over here, and then last one. Okay. Yes, please.
Yeah, mine is a small comments about unless we have a political understanding, you cannot have a economic understanding, because we have a lack of political understanding. Recently, the way Ambassador pointed out, BRICS, our members of BRICS are trying to unstabilize democracy in India and rest of the world. So why not to first understand politically?
Thank you very much. And then last comment, please, from the floor.
Hi, my name is Karthikeya and I work at RIS. My capacity of questioning is basically of a 21-year-old who has a stake in the future of the Global South. My question, the first one is to Mr. David. Basically, when you said that the DFIs within India were commercialized in '94, and in '94 China created more robust DFIs. My question is particularly, is there a way to incentivize the commercial banks or the investment banks to invest in the development infrastructure of their own country with partnering with the government so that they have a stake in the future? Is there a way we can incentivize that, sort of promise them a stake in the future of the development of a nation, which is fairly ambiguous, but I guess you're a banker, so you would give the perfect way to incentivize a banker who would be interested in profits, but as well as national development. My second question is, again, more from a youth standpoint. I'm hearing all of this nomenclature, which is extremely encouraging, that this is not a donor-donee relationship, it's a development partnership. But empirically speaking, how do we, so basically the advent of this entire phenomena of SSC is a result of South countries feeling left out from the global development regime and seeing the North countries skyrocketing in their GDPs and development. How do we ensure that within the Global South, countries which are not developing as fast but are still part of this structure, which is not yet, this is why we're here, which is not yet theorized, it's very contextual. The southern countries, let's say the LDCs or countries in Southeast Asia, they do not feel left out, and they do not eventually opt out of South-South cooperation, form a regime of their own, like the Global South has now. I guess this could be a general question to the rest of the panel. Thank you.
Thank you. Now that the youth of India has spoken, we can now get back to our panelists. Thank you. Thank you for that question. Let me give my panelists and commentators maybe 1 minute. 1.5 minutes, okay? Professor Mohant, why don't you start? 1.5 minutes, please. I won't have time to warn you, you know.
Yes. To the question on conditionality, it's a fact that in many programs we find that there is conditionality applicable to many developing countries. As you know that from various theoretical foundations, that you really cannot prove that with conditionality we can really have sustained growth, and we also see that with the various development program we can sustain growth. Therefore, it is really required is that constant evidence to show that there is no room for conditionality in terms of pursuing growth in developing countries. I think it is to be pursued. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, please.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think you're comparing apples and oranges. Nowhere in the world, nowhere will a commercial banking system be looking at financing long duration infrastructure projects or even industrial projects. They're not geared for it. Their resource base is primarily short term, not long term, which means they run an asset liability mismatch. They don't have the skills to appraise it. So you're asking somebody to do a job which he's not geared for. You do need development financial institutions. There's no shortcut. The second part of your question, how do you incentivize? At least using India as the basis, I think you need to first create an element of trust. Because if you're bringing the private sector, you spoke about investment banks, I presume you mean generally private sector institutions. If you're going to bring them into what is effectively a PPP structure, then there has to be that confidence in the judicial system and in the government as a regulator. Because in a PPP, your government is a counterparty and is also a regulator. And what we have seen, unfortunately, is significant cases of regulatory capture, which tilts the playing field, and then the private sector stops believing. The last point on what is the remedy. Look, I think we give insufficient credit to the Indian saver. Whenever there has been a bond issue in the Indian market, and I'll ask you to go back maybe 3 years to the tax-free bonds, we're probably the only country in the world, though I don't have data to back up the statement, where a fixed income bond issue to a retail investment base was oversubscribed massively. So if you have a reliable rating agency system, the money is there, the investor is willing. We just need to have confidence and develop that bond market. Very short answer, but I hope it serves.
Thank you. Yes, Anthea, please.
I'll just respond to the one issue on conditionality. I don't actually think I said anything about conditionality in my remarks, but I would say you're right. I agree with you that there still is conditionality. I wouldn't call it conditionality. I would call it mutual benefit. I think it's more in those terms. So, but for sure, your example about the China and the UN and the Pacific Islands, for example, there's definitely interest. Mutual benefit has conditionality kind of woven into it. It's just different language.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you. I'm also going to pick up on the conditionality thing, and it was clumsily expressed on my behalf, so I'm sorry. In fact, Paolo and I were just finessing it. Yeah. I mean, if you look at Greece, Greece has had an iron-fisted and iron glove, old-fashioned IMF conditionality of the worst sort. But I think I do want to row back. I do want to say that some of the old-fashioned, sometimes the north-south thing is expressed very simplistically. Oh, northern donors do conditionality and we don't. Oh, come on, So I think that's what I would contest. And one reason, perhaps India and China don't have to do so much strong economic conditionality is because the World Bank's doing it for them. So you can protest against conditionality, but be very pleased that the World Bank is dropping capital controls and in Africa and elsewhere. So there's a bit of free riding as well on multilateral-led neoliberal conditionality. So I think it's just a more complex situation than the simple thing that the North's pushing policy conditionality and the South is holding up sovereignty.
Thank
you. I follow Emma's on the question of conditionalities. There are two caveats, though. I think that the very idea that we have international financial institutions imposing structural adjustments everywhere, this ended. We have a structural adjustment, we must have fiscal discipline and so on and so forth, but this is actually imposed by the market. It's rating agencies and so on and so forth. It's embedded in the market in a way. The problem is, as you said, social environmental regulation, and there's no conditionalities regarding social environmental regulation anymore. Not even the World Bank. The World Bank has a bunch of safeguards, but they are actually betting on country systems. So they, in a way, these institutions are adopting a southern vocabulary of non-interference. Which is really, really, really risky in that sense. And that may be a problem. This is when you see things happening in many, many countries at the same time, something's happening at the systemic level. I mean, if you look at the Amazon countries, 5 Amazon countries, not to mention Venezuela, which is melting down, but at least 5 Amazon countries are flexibilizing the social environmental regulation at the same time. In terms of mining, it's a mess. And this is for attracting investments. And these investments are being baked by public money, by financial institutions, and so on and so forth. So that's a big problem, I think. On the global governance, I don't think I was optimistic. On the contrary, I'm really skeptical about the ability of these institutions actually to provide any kind of order and regulation in a way. On the BRICS IBSA thing. I think there is one issue about the BRICS, which is related to one side effect of the BRICS effect. The BRICS effect discentered the entire world order, but there is another effect that we didn't mention, or we touch very lightly here, which is the fact that there is an effect up on the south. What we call South now has changed, and I'm not sure. I'm sure that we cannot call South as a homogeneous entity. I think we never could call it as a homogeneous entity, but we cannot call in any sense. And this fragmentation of the South is generating something very, very interesting, which is emerging recipients. Which is precisely the case of Brazil and if I'm not mistaken, South Africa. We are emerging recipients. We are not emerging donors anymore. We are becoming more and more clients of China, and in the future, I would say, India, in 1 week from now, probably. And this is a problem for the ability of this group to deliver something meaningful. Internationally. For the BAPA, I don't know, Pilani, who is going to win this new battle. I'm afraid the LDCs will lose. I hope Jorge can help us to save it. But I do think that there is one key agenda, as I mentioned before. One key agenda for BAPA is the bringing back responsibility, and together with the responsibility, there is one agenda that I do think it's critical, is leaving no one behind. It's how to make South-South cooperation work for leaving no one behind. How to make development cooperation work for leaving no one behind. I think this is the critical agenda, is how to tie development cooperation to internationally agreed goals. And on the end of donorship, I think this is actually a narrative move which would allow donors to use ODA money to bring the private sector in. This is something that Andrea mentioned before. There is this enormous trend among DAC, OECD DAC countries to get public money, public funds related to ODA. Andrea mentioned some facilities here, and bring this money to, this ODA money to de-risk or to offer guarantees to the private sector engagement. To do that, we must have to adopt the language or the vocabulary of mutual benefits. The idea of the old idea of donorship does not fit in this new narrative. Thank you. Sorry for taking so long.
Yes, I will be very brief because, as I said, we'll have my opportunity tomorrow. I think both IBSA and BRICS are an idea that is beginning to take material form. It's nowhere like the European Union. It's no substitute to the United Nations system. It is somewhere, if we want comparisons, it's before the 1962 Rome Statute that established the European Union, but it will not go that way because it will not build the kind of institutions that the European Union did. The New Development Bank is brand new. It's just made its first outlay of resources towards renewable projects. The second one is happening now. Everybody should be focusing on it, from civil society to thinkers, anybody, and smack the place into proper South and South cooperation. It's all brand new. But the responsibility in terms of the future is enormous. We're talking about 42% of the world's population. If we fail this time, we're failing you. So it's your duty to keep us on our toes. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I just
Professor,
want to
yes.
respond to my former student's question about, will the LDCs opt out of the South regime itself because they feel shortchanged or discriminated by the, to use Amitabh's phrase, a power South. I know he's used this phrase before, the power South as in like the dominant creamy layer within the global South. Are they actually, in a way, reproducing cycles of exploitation of the weakest who are at the bottom of the ladder? I think the opt-out, if you look at it one way, if you look on a climate issue, for example, already they have, because you look at the small island nations, they have formed a coalition of their own that challenges China and India and Brazil. And the biggies already. And likewise on different issue-based areas, you might find coalitions of the weakest. But I think they will be more effective in getting heard if it is transcontinental, meaning Pacific Island nations and Caribbean nations are actually quite far, as you know. But if you have an Atlantic/Pacific coming together, then you have like 30 or 40 or more nation states with a voice in the General Assembly. So you may have to go beyond geographical notions of small states and their articulation of their group interests. We need a kind of a pan or a global level of coalition for them to really be effective and to persuade the power South, to use Amitabh's phrase, to behave and to not to forget where they came from.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think I would like to thank those who have given very important questions and the answers that our panelists and special commentators have given. I have nothing to add to that, but I would like to mention that we have to remember that South-South cooperation means cooperation between countries which are also developing, and they have dual roles. See, if you look at poverty, concentration of in numbers is mostly in developing South, is not the LDCs. So I think it's developing South providing assist and support to the other countries. And from that perspective, I think the issue of conditionalities, and I'm very glad that over these 4 daily dialogues, we are now getting into the nitty-gritties and the challenges, and that's why the issue of risk that you have mentioned, Anthea, that what are the implications in terms of the accumulating debt servicing liabilities, the responsibility of our countries to use South-South cooperation in a judicious manner. All these are becoming very important because we are talking about billions of dollars. India has provided Bangladesh, for example, 3 lines of credit, $1 billion, $2 billion, and $5 billion. In total, $8 billion. China is providing $25 billion. So all these, if we cannot really use these in an appropriate manner, these will create, the bottom line and the balance sheet will show up. And also with regard to conditionalities, for example, the Indian line of credit, during the first line of credit, the one conditionality was that 85% of the procurement will have to be from India. Now, that has its own implications. We have been fighting against, North-South tide aid for 40 years. And now this, but because, and that's the, challenge, that it is developing country providing, support to other developing countries. Developing countries where there are so many, difficulties which they are facing themselves. So one will have to keep, I think, that in mind. The other is that, I was in Buenos Aires, and we have Argentinian friends around, and the WTO couldn't come up with any ministerial declaration. New issues are coming up, mega RTS, where we are not members, but the rules will be set in the mega regional trading arrangements. So all these are also, as I was mentioning, both push factors and pull factors are there. So from that perspective, a deeper understanding about South-South cooperation and the risks and the rewards is so important. And so from that perspective, I think all of us will be leaving this room, much enriched and with many insights from the panelists, special commentators, and also the very important questions that were put forward. So thank you very much, and on behalf of all of you, I would like to thank our panelists and commentators, and on behalf of them, I would like to thank you.
And I must thank you, Professor Mustafizur Rahman, on behalf of organizers, for helping us manage the time. It's 1:30, and friends, we would have lunch break for 1 hour. This room is called Silver Oak. Just above that is Jacaranda, and the one below in the basement is Magnolia. We have laid out lunch here outside and also upstairs. Those of you who are interested in following the discussion on health, science, and technology can come back to this room after an hour, and those who are interested in agriculture may go upstairs in Jacaranda, and Magnolia would hold discussion on trade and investment. So enjoy your lunch. Thank you.